I sat in judgment of other men for 30 years. I thought nothing could shake me anymore. Then my 9-year-old grandson looked at his dinner plate and asked me if he was allowed to use the bathroom. One quiet question, and I knew something was wrong inside my own son's house. What I found hidden under a pillow that night started a war I never wanted to fight. This is my story. I've sentenced men to prison for 30 years. I've read confessions, depositions, sworn testimony from killers who looked me dead in the eye and never blinked. But nothing in 3 decades on the federal bench prepared me for the moment my 9-year-old grandson sat across from me at the dinner table, looked at his plate, and whispered, "Grandpa, am I allowed to use the bathroom?" That single question told me everything I needed to know about what was happening inside my own son's house. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started, with a truck I recognized pulling into my driveway on a Thursday afternoon in July, moving faster than a man should when he's dropping his child off for the summer. I was in the backyard when I heard the engine. Ruth had planted apple trees along the south fence the spring before she died, and I'd been doing what I always did these days, standing near them without doing anything useful. 18 months since I buried her, and I still hadn't figured out what to do with my hands when the afternoon got quiet. I wiped my palms on my jeans and came around the side of the house. Aaron was already out of the vehicle. 42 years old, wearing a pressed shirt on a Thursday afternoon, like he had somewhere important to be afterward. He had my height, but his mother's coloring dark hair, dark eyes, and a jaw that had been set tight since sometime in his 30s. I used to think that was ambition. Watching him pull a single bag from the back seat without looking up, I wasn't so sure anymore. Elijah climbed out on his own. 9 years old, small for his age, wearing a gray t-shirt and carrying a backpack against his chest, with both arms wrapped around it, not slung over one shoulder the way boys carry backpacks, but against his chest, both arms. I filed that away without knowing yet why it mattered. "Dad." Aaron said it like a transaction. "Aaron." I came down the porch steps. "Wasn't expecting you until 4. Traffic was light." He set the bag on the bottom step without looking at Elijah. 5 days. I'll be back Tuesday." I looked at my grandson. He was standing 2 feet behind his father, eyes on the porch boards, backpack still against his chest. "Hey, bud," I said. "Good to see you." He looked up. "Hi, Grandpa." Quiet. Careful. The kind of careful that 9-year-olds aren't usually. "Elijah." Aaron said it without turning. The boy straightened slightly, like a small correction had been applied to his posture. "Take your bag up to the guest room." Elijah reached for the duffel without putting the backpack down. He managed both bag in one hand, backpack still against his chest with the other arm, and went through the front door without another word. I turned back to Aaron. "Everything all right?" "Fine." He already had his keys out. He's been fed. He knows the rules. "What rules?" "Bedtime at 9. No screens after 7. He knows." Aaron moved toward the driver's side. "I'll call when we land." "Where are you going?" "Business." He said it the way people say things that are technically true. I'd heard that cadence 10,000 times from witnesses on the stand. I let it go. "Aaron." He stopped with his hand on the door. "Come inside for 10 minutes. Have a coffee. I'm late." He got in and started the engine before the door was fully closed. I watched his truck back out. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He didn't wave. He just went. 30 years on the bench taught me to read what people didn't say in the space between their words and the door closing. That departure said plenty. Inside, Elijah was standing in the living room with both bags at his feet, waiting. Not looking around, not touching anything. Just standing like he was accustomed to arriving in places and waiting for instructions. "Guest room's the second door on the left," I said. You remember. He nodded and picked up both bags. You can leave the backpack down here if you want. He looked at me. I'll keep it with me. Sure. I let it go. Hungry. He thought about it. A 9-year-old being asked if he's hungry on a hot July afternoon should not have to think about it. A little, he said finally. I'll make something around 6. At 6, I made pan-fried chicken and green beans. Ruth used to say the best meals were ones that didn't make anyone nervous. Standing at that stove listening to Elijah come down the stairs, I was beginning to understand she might have meant something else. He sat where I pointed. He placed his hands flat on the table on either side of his plate and looked at the food with assessment, not appetite. Go ahead, I said. He picked up his fork. We ate mostly in silence. What made me uncomfortable was the way he ate efficiently, without pleasure, eyes moving occasionally to the kitchen doorway, like he was tracking something I couldn't see. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork. Grandpa? Yeah. Am I allowed to use the bathroom? I put down my own fork and looked at him. He was looking at his plate. His hands were flat again, very still, the way hands get when a person is bracing for an answer they're not sure about. Elijah. I kept my voice level. You don't have to ask permission to use the bathroom. Not here. Not ever. Something moved across his face, quick, complicated, and then it was gone. Okay, he said. Same goes for getting water, going outside, anything a person needs. He nodded, picked up his fork and went back to eating. Eyes on his plate now, not the doorway. After dinner, he carried his plate to the sink without being asked. Rinsed it. Set it in the rack with the careful precision of someone who'd learned there were consequences for not doing it right. He asked quietly if he could go to bed. It was 7:30. I told him yes. He went upstairs. I sat at the table with my coffee going cold, listening to the house settle. Through the window, Ruth's apple trees were going dark against the evening sky. I had spent 30 years in a courtroom, learning to trust what I couldn't yet prove. I couldn't prove anything. Not yet. The house was quiet, in the way old houses get after midnight. Settled, deliberate each sound, distinct against the silence. I'd been in the study for 2 hours with a glass of bourbon I hadn't touched, thinking about a 9-year-old who asked permission to use the bathroom. Ruth used to say I brought the courtroom home. She meant I had a habit of examining things that deserved simply to be felt. Standing up from the desk at 1:30, I decided she was right, and that I didn't much care. I went upstairs to check on Elijah. The guest room door was where he'd left it, resting against the frame, not fully closed. I eased it open another few inches. He was on his side, one arm tucked under the pillow, the backpack on the floor directly beside the bed, where he could reach it without sitting up. He'd fallen asleep in his clothes. I crossed to the window and lowered it 2 inches against the night air. Then I reached for the folded blanket at the foot of the bed. The pillow shifted when I lifted the corner of the blanket, just slightly, and something slid out from underneath it and dropped to the floor without a sound. An envelope. White. Standard size. No name on the front. Sealed, but not well. The flap had been opened and resealed so many times the adhesive had given up entirely. Held shut now by nothing more than habit. I stood looking at it on the floor. Elijah hadn't moved. His breathing was slow and even. I reached down, picked it up, and carried it out of the room, pulling the door back to exactly where it had been. In the study, I sat at the desk and set the envelope under the lamp. The handwriting on the inside flap, visible through the worn paper, was a child's. Block letters, slightly uneven. The careful printing of a 9-year-old trying hard to be legible. I've opened a great many documents in my life. Court orders, sealed testimony, evidence, envelopes, letters from men on death row. Each carries its own weight in the hand. This was the lightest thing I'd held in 30 years, and it was the heaviest. I opened it. 2 pages of lined notebook paper, The same careful block print. No date, no name at the top. It began the way children begin things when they're not sure who's listening. To anyone who finds this. I read it twice. Then I set it down and looked at the wall. He hadn't used names, just Dad and the rules and what happens when. The language was simple because he was 9, not because the things he was describing were simple. He wrote about meals, when they happened, when they didn't, and the difference. He wrote about a room in the basement he called the quiet room, and the rules about how long you stayed. He wrote about a lock on his bedroom door, and mornings when he wasn't sure what he'd done wrong, but understood something must have been wrong because of how the day started. He wrote these things the way a person writes a record. Not a complaint, a record. The way someone writes when they understand at some level they can't name that what they're putting down might matter to someone someday. The last paragraph was the shortest. If you're reading this and you're not me, please don't tell Dad I wrote it. He said if I make trouble outside the house, Mom will have to leave. I don't want Mom to leave. She is the only good thing that stays. He'll take away the only window in my room. I sat with that for a long time. A 9-year-old had written a letter addressed to no one in particular, carried it in that backpack he wouldn't put down, and hidden it in a pillow in a house he'd visited twice. Not mailed it, not given it to a teacher or a neighbor. Hidden it. Like a message in a bottle, thrown not into the ocean, but into the one place he'd apparently decided had a chance of being safe. 30 years on the bench taught me that evidence doesn't announce itself. It waits to be found by whoever is patient enough or desperate enough to go looking. This boy had handed me evidence without meaning to. He'd simply run out of options and chosen the best one available, which happened to be a pillow in his grandfather's guest room. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Carried it upstairs, eased the door open, placed it back under the pillow exactly as I'd found it. Elijah hadn't moved. The backpack was still beside the bed. Through the window, I'd lowered the faint smell of Ruth's apple trees came up from the backyard. I went back down to the study. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a yellow legal pad, the kind I'd used for 30 years to organize my thinking before a difficult case. I uncapped a pen, looked at the blank page for a moment, then I wrote one word at the top: evidence. Beneath it, I began writing everything I'd observed since Aaron's truck pulled into my driveway. The backpack against the chest, the stillness in the living room, the eyes moving to the kitchen doorway, the plate rinsed with adult precision, the question about the bathroom. And now the letter. 2 pages in a child's block print, addressed to anyone who might find it, asking only that the finder not make trouble. I wrote until 3 in the morning. 4 pages of notes. 1 word at the top of the first page that covered everything I knew and everything I intended to find out. Whatever was happening in my son's house had been happening long enough that a 9-year-old had developed a system for surviving it. Long enough that he'd learned to write things down. Long enough that he'd learned to hide what he wrote. I was going to need to understand exactly how long. I slept 3 hours and woke before 5, which was normal now. Sleep had become a negotiation. Since Ruth died, you took what it offered and didn't argue the terms. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad, and read through what I'd written while the sky outside went from black to the gray-purple that comes just ahead of a Tennessee summer sunrise. By the time Elijah came downstairs at 7, I had the pad closed and breakfast started on the stove. He appeared in the doorway, wearing the same gray t-shirt and a pair of shorts. Hair uncombed, backpack over one shoulder. He'd changed his mind about keeping it against his chest. Progress, maybe. Or just the logic of stairs. "Morning," I said. "Sleep all right?" "Yes, sir." He set the backpack on the floor by the door, close enough to reach, not on his person. A small concession to normalcy. "Eggs okay? Scrambled or fried?" He thought about it. That same pause from the night before, the one that didn't belong on a 9-year-old's face when someone asked what he wanted for breakfast. "Scrambled is fine," he said. "If that's what you're making, I'm making whatever you want. That's how it works here." He looked at me, then at the stove, then back. "Scrambled, please." I made them with butter and cheddar toast on the side. Orange juice in a glass, because Ruth always said cartons made juice taste like cardboard. And some things you held on to. I set the plate in front of him and sat across with my coffee. He ate quickly. Not the panicked speed of genuine hunger, something more controlled. Efficient, purposeful, like someone moving through a task before conditions changed. His eyes went to the kitchen doorway twice in the first 5 minutes. The third time, he seemed to catch himself and stopped. "How's school?" I asked. "Good." "What grade?" "4th." He took a piece of toast. "We did a project on state birds. Tennessee's is the mockingbird. Know what that means?" He shook his head, chewing carefully. "Means it can sound like almost anything. Mimics other birds so well you can't tell the difference unless you know what to listen for." I drank my coffee. Takes patience to learn the difference. He considered this with the seriousness that was simply his way. Not solemn, just careful. Like someone who'd learned that words meant something and deserved to be treated accordingly. "Do you like birds?" he asked. "Your grandmother did. She had feeders out back. I keep meaning to refill them." "What kind came?" "Cardinals mostly, finches, the occasional mockingbird." I paused. She kept a list, species she'd seen. Had a little notebook for it. Elijah finished his eggs and set the fork down with the same precision I'd noticed the night before. Placed, not dropped. "Can I see the feeders?" "After breakfast." "Sure." We sat for a moment in the quiet that I was learning was simply how he occupied space. Not uncomfortable with silence, not filling it unnecessarily. Another thing that didn't fit a 9-year-old. I decided to try something I'd used for 30 years. The indirect approach. Not questions pointing at what you wanted to know. Questions that circled from a distance and let the witness come to it themselves. "Your dad said you've been busy this summer," I said. "Lots going on." "Some." "No." "Do things at home keep a pretty regular schedule?" A small pause. "There are rules about schedules. What time things happen." "That can be helpful," I said carefully. "Knowing what to expect." He looked at his plate. "Sometimes." "What happens if the schedule changes?" He looked up at me. His eyes were his mother's dark brown, set wide, always doing 2 things at once. Listening to what you said and deciding how much to tell you. "Asking about changes doesn't help," he said. "It's better to just wait and see." "Better how?" "At home, asking twice means you don't get it at all." He said it simply, the way you'd state a fact about weather. A law of the household, as established and unchallengeable as gravity. I set my coffee down. Kept my face the way I kept it on the bench when a witness said something that changed the shape of a case. Unchanged. Attentive. Giving nothing away. "That's a hard rule to live with," I said. He shrugged. Not dismissive, the shrug of someone who'd made peace with a difficult fact. "You learn the other rules instead. The ones that don't change." "Like what?" He thought about it. "Quiet at meals unless spoken to. Finish everything on the plate. Don't leave a room without saying where you're going. Don't talk about inside things outside." He counted on his fingers without drama, just inventory. "Those sound like rules for someone older than 9, I said. "Dad says children who can't follow adult rules become adults who can't follow any rules." A pause. He read it in a book. I thought of 30 years of juvenile cases. Children handed adult burdens before they had adult shoulders for them. "Do other kids at school have rules like that?" I asked. He considered this longer than the question seemed to warrant. "There was a boy in my class last year. Marcus." A pause, shorter. He had some of the same ones. Same rules. Some. His hands went still on the table. He'd been about to say something else. I could see it, the thought arriving, then the door closing in front of it. He moved, Elijah said. His family moved away. That's too bad. Yeah. He looked at the window. Ruth's apple trees threw long shadows across the grass, the empty bird feeders hanging still in the July heat. I gave him the silence. In 30 years, I'd learned that quiet after an almost sentence was more valuable than any follow-up question. Let it breathe. Let the person decide. But Elijah had decided. The door was closed. Whatever he'd been about to say about Marcus, he'd put it back with the same care he used putting everything else back. A 9-year-old who had learned that silence was safer than sentences. I'd spent 30 years trying to teach that discipline to adults. Someone had already taught it to my grandson, and not gently. You want to see those feeders? I asked. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but close. Yeah, he said. He carried his plate to the sink, rinsed it, placed it in the rack. I watched without comment. Some habits you don't name, because naming makes them visible, and visible makes them real. And real makes the person wearing them think about why they learned them. He picked up the backpack one shoulder this time. We went outside into the Tennessee morning. Elijah spent the afternoon in the backyard. I'd given him Ruth's old field guide, a battered paperback she'd kept on the kitchen windowsill for 20 years, spine cracked, margins full of her handwriting, and told him he could refill the bird feeders if he wanted. He'd looked at the book the way children look at things they've been trusted with unexpectedly, with careful reverence that made something tighten in my chest. By 2 o'clock, he'd refilled both feeders and was sitting cross-legged under the nearest apple tree with the guide open in his lap and the backpack beside him. I watched from the kitchen window for a moment. Then I went to the study. I needed the homeowner's insurance renewal documents. The annual review was overdue, and I'd been putting it off, the way I'd been putting off most things that required me to sit at that desk and go through files Ruth had organized and I'd been leaving untouched. I knew the general geography. Insurance in the second drawer left side behind the household expenses folder. I opened the second drawer. The insurance folder was where it should have been. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. Then, out of habit, the 30-year habit of a man who read everything twice, I glanced at the folder behind it before closing the drawer. The label read, Property and Legal A, Gains, POA. I stood there for a moment. Then I put the insurance folder down and pulled out the one behind it. Aaron had set up the power of attorney 14 months ago, shortly after Ruth's funeral. He'd presented it as practical. I was 69, recently widowed, alone in a house worth considerable money, without any formal arrangement for what happened to my affairs if something happened to me. He'd had a lawyer prepare the documents. I'd read them, or believed I had, and signed where indicated. It had seemed responsible. Ruth would have approved. The folder was thicker than it should have been. I sat down and opened it under the lamp. The original POA documents were there. My signature on the last page, notarized, dated 14 months ago. Behind them were 3 additional documents I had no memory of signing. Each was a real estate transaction authorization. Each bore my signature and the POA seal. Each dated within the last 4 months. The first was from March. A property acquisition authorization for a parcel in East Nashville. A mixed-use development on Gallatin Avenue. The amount listed was $94,000. The second was from April. Same project, different phase, $112,000. The third was from 6 weeks ago. $61,000, same project, labeled as a completion funding contribution. I set the papers down and looked at the wall. $267,000. The number came without effort, the way numbers always had, the one mental faculty age had left entirely alone. $267,000 had left my accounts in 4 months, authorized by my signature on documents I had never seen, for a project I had never heard of. I pulled up the bank's website, entered my credentials, found the transaction history I'd been reviewing monthly, without, I understood now, reviewing carefully enough. The withdrawals were there, not hidden, not labeled obscurely, listed as investment transfers, authorized with the POA reference number attached to each. Everything correct. Everything completely legal. I called the bank, waded through the automated system, asked for a senior account manager. I need to verify 3 transactions from the past 4 months, I said. POA referenced authorization transfers. She pulled the records, walked me through each one. The POA documentation was on file, she said. Each transfer had been initiated by the authorized agent, Aaron Gaines, and processed in accordance with the power of attorney terms. Everything verified against the original notarized document. Were any flagged for secondary verification? I asked. A call to me directly. The POA agreement doesn't require secondary verification for transactions under $500,000, Mr. Gaines. The agent has full authorization within those parameters. I see. Thank you. I hung up and opened my laptop. Searched for the East Nashville development on Gallatin Avenue. 11 minutes to find what I was looking for, because it wasn't on a company website or a press release. It was in a Business Journal article from 2 months ago, buried in a roundup of local development news. The Gallatin Avenue project had stalled. The primary investor group had encountered what the article described as significant financing complications. 2 of 3 anchor tenants had withdrawn. The project was, in the careful language of business journalism, facing an uncertain timeline. In the language of 30 years on the federal bench, the project was failing. The money going into it was not coming back. I closed the laptop. Aaron had been moving for months. The authorization documents were prepared and executed with a precision that spoke of planning, not impulse. The amounts had been structured carefully, each below the threshold that might trigger automatic review, each timed far enough apart to avoid pattern recognition. This was not a bad investment decision. This was a series of very deliberate ones, using money that was not his, with documentation bearing a signature obtained under circumstances I was only now beginning to examine clearly. I thought about that afternoon 14 months ago. Aaron at my kitchen table with a folder of papers. His voice careful and warm, the voice he used when he wanted something. Dad, with Mom gone, we need to make sure you're protected. It's what she would have wanted. Ruth would not have wanted this. I opened the legal pad to a fresh page and wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. Transaction dates, amounts, project references, bank confirmation, details. When I finished, I looked at what I had. $267,000. 4 months. A failing project. A power of attorney obtained under false pretenses. And Aaron somewhere between here and wherever his business trip had taken him, with 72 hours he believed were his to use. I'd been counting those hours as time I had to figure out what was happening. I was wrong. They were time he had, and from what I could see in those transaction records, he was almost done using them. I heard it at 3:10, a sound so small it shouldn't have woken me, except I hadn't been fully asleep. The creak of the 3rd stair from the bottom. Ruth had been after me to fix it for 20 years. Now I was glad I hadn't. I got up, pulled on the flannel shirt draped over the chair, and went downstairs. The kitchen was dark, except for the amber glow of the microwave clock, 3:14, and faint blue light through the window. Elijah was sitting on the floor, back against the cabinet under the sink, knees pulled up, arms around them. Gray t-shirt, bare feet, no backpack. He looked up when I came in, Didn't startle, just waited to see what I would do. I crossed the kitchen, lowered myself to the floor, my knees registering their opinion, and sat beside him with my back against the cabinet, both of us facing the dark kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, something moved in Ruth's apple trees. I didn't turn on any lights, didn't ask what was wrong. In 30 years of courtrooms, the worst thing you could do with a witness who had finally decided to be present was make the moment feel like an occasion. We sat like that for a while. I couldn't sleep, he said. Me neither. Happens most nights. The clock ticked to 3:15. Grandpa. Yeah. He worked something out in the silence beside me. The particular tension of a person deciding whether to say the thing they came to say. If someone does something bad to you every day, he said slowly, does it stop being bad? Like, does it become normal instead? I didn't answer right away. The question behind the question was always more important than the question itself. A 9-year-old asking whether bad things became normal over time wasn't asking for philosophy. He was asking whether what had been done to him had permanently changed what he deserved. No, I said. It doesn't stop being bad. It just stops feeling surprising. What's the difference? Surprising is about what you expect. Bad is about what's true. Stopping being surprised by something doesn't mean it was ever all right. He was quiet for a while. Was there ever a case in court where someone did something bad to a kid for a long time, and the kid didn't tell anyone? Many, I said. Why didn't they tell? Different reasons. Sometimes they were afraid of what would happen. Sometimes they'd been told that telling would hurt someone they loved. Sometimes they'd just stopped believing it would change anything. He was very still beside me. The ones who finally did tell, I said. Most of them said the same thing afterward. That they'd been waiting for someone who looked like they'd actually do something. Not just listen. Do something. The clock ticked to 3:22. Dad says if I tell anyone, Elijah said, Mom will have to leave. He said it the way he said most things. Quietly. The way you state a fact you've carried so long it's lost its sharp edges. Not a confession. Just a fact he'd finally decided to set down somewhere outside himself. I didn't move. Didn't change my breathing. He told you that? I said. He said if I make trouble outside the house stops working. And if the house stops working, Mom has to go. A pause. He said it more than once, so I'd remember. I thought of the letter upstairs. She is the only good thing that stays. The boy hadn't hidden that letter because he was afraid of punishment. He'd hidden it because he was protecting someone. 9 years old, and his primary concern was his mother. Elijah, I kept my voice level. What your father told you, it's not true. What's happening in your house is not something you caused. And it's not something you can fix by staying quiet. He looked at me in the blue darkness. How do you know? Because I spent 30 years watching people try to fix broken things by staying quiet. It doesn't work. The broken thing just gets more broken. He looked back at the window. The faint shapes of the apple trees outside. She's not going to have to leave, I said. That's not how it works outside your father's house. There are different rules out here. Another long silence. Are you going to do something, he asked? Like the judges in your cases? I reached over and turned on the small light above the stove. Soft yellow across the kitchen floor, warm, ordinary. The kind of light Ruth used to turn on when she couldn't sleep. I'm already doing something, I said. Since yesterday afternoon. Something moved across his face. Not relief, not trust. Something earlier than both. The first tentative step toward them. Can I have a glass of water? He asked. You can have whatever you need. You don't have to ask. He got up, filled a glass from the tap, drank it at the sink, looking out at the dark backyard. Then he set it in the rack, carefully, precisely. the habit, unbreakable even now, and turned around. "I'm going to try to sleep," he said. "Good idea. I'll be here in the morning." He went upstairs. I listened to his footsteps cross the hallway, the guest room door, the sound of a child getting back into bed. I sat on the kitchen floor for another 20 minutes in the yellow light, looking at nothing in particular. He'd been waiting for someone who looked like they'd actually do something. He'd put a letter in a pillow in a house he'd visited twice and waited to see if the right person would find it. I'd found it. Now I had to make sure I was the person he'd decided I was. Margaret Holloway's office sat on the 4th floor of a building on Church Street that had been renovated twice since I'd last visited it as an active judge. The elevator still groaned on the way up. Some things don't change, regardless of how much money you spend on marble flooring. I'd called her at 7 that morning. She'd answered on the second ring, which told me she was already at her desk. Margaret had been one of the sharpest family law attorneys in Davidson County for nearly 3 decades. We'd worked opposing sides of enough cases that I trusted her judgment the way you trust a good opposing counsel completely, because you've seen what they do when the pressure is real. I didn't tell her everything on the phone. I told her enough. She said, "Come in at 3. I left Elijah with my neighbor, Dorothy Marsh, a retired school teacher who kept a cookie jar on her counter and asked no unnecessary questions. Elijah carried his backpack to her door out of habit. I didn't say anything about it. Some habits take time. Margaret's office was orderly, in the way that working spaces become orderly when someone has stopped pretending to be anything other than what they are. No decorative items, no framed inspirational quotes. Just files, a whiteboard, and 2 chairs positioned at angles that said, "This is where work happens." She poured coffee without asking and set a yellow legal pad on the desk between us. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start from when Aaron dropped the boy off." I told her. I spoke the way I'd learned to speak on the bench, sequentially, without editorializing, letting the facts carry the weight. I told her about the backpack, the bathroom question, the breakfast rules, the letter I'd found in the pillowcase. I told her about the 3 transactions totaling $267,000. I set the folder on her desk when I got to that part. She opened it without reaching for it, dramatically. She just read. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at me. "The POA," she said. "When did you sign it?" 4 years ago. Aaron had just started the development project on Meridian Street. He needed flexibility to act on my behalf during a period when I was traveling for a federal appellate consultation. The scope was clearly defined. "Clearly defined and clearly exceeded," she said. "Yes." She wrote 3 lines on the yellow pad. I recognized the habit. I used to do the same thing on the bench right before speaking, so that what came out of your mouth was already structured. "We're looking at 2 separate tracks," she said. "The first is child welfare. Based on what you've described, we have grounds for an emergency protective order. The letter alone documented preserved, combined with the behavioral indicators you've observed, gives us a strong initial filing. A child psychologist's assessment would strengthen it considerably, but we don't need it to start." And the second track, financial fraud. The POA was not authorized for those transactions. If your bank records confirm the transfers and the documentation shows Aaron as the authorizing party under that POA, you're looking at a civil complaint at minimum. Potentially criminal referral, depending on what the full picture looks like. "There may be more to the picture," I said. I told her about the conversation with Ray Simmons, a retired Metro Nashville detective I'd known for 20 years. Who now did private investigative work for a small firm on Nolensville Road. I'd called Ray after leaving the bank. I told him what I'd found and gave him Nelson Pruitt's name, which had appeared twice in the transaction documents as the coordinating legal counsel. Ray had called me back within 2 hours. "Pruitt's been on the edge of 2 other estate fraud complaints in the last 6 years, I told Margaret. Neither went to prosecution. One was withdrawn by the family. The other was settled quietly. Ray found a similar pattern in both a son or son-in-law with POA access, a failing real estate venture, and Pruitt's name as coordinating counsel in the transaction paperwork. Margaret set her pen down. "That's not coincidence." "No," I said. "It isn't." She stood and moved to her whiteboard. She wrote 2 columns. On the left, child welfare. On the right, financial fraud. Underneath each, she began listing actions: emergency protective order, custodial evaluation, asset freeze, petition, criminal referral to the DA's office, and on the financial side, a parallel referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, if Pruitt's involvement crossed state lines. "The Henderson family," I said. "That's the name Ray gave me for the Knoxville complaint that was withdrawn. George and Carol Henderson. Their son was involved in a similar arrangement with Pruitt." "Have you contacted them?" "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first." She nodded. "Contact them. In person if you can. A withdrawn complaint doesn't mean they stopped believing something happened. It usually means they were scared, pressured, or exhausted. If they're willing to talk, what they tell you could tie Pruitt's pattern together in a way that makes the federal referral much cleaner." She turned back from the whiteboard and looked at me directly. "Walter, Aaron is your son." "I know what he is," I said. "I'm not asking you to explain your feelings. I'm telling you that this process will require you to act against him in a legal forum, in writing, on record. The protective order for Elijah will list Aaron as the respondent. His name will be attached to the financial complaint. Whatever relationship you have with him, whatever you're hoping for on the other side of this, I need you to be clear that the path forward goes through a reckoning first." I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. "I've presided over enough reckonings," I said, "to know that's the only path worth taking." She wrote one more line on the yellow pad, tore it off, and handed it to me. It had Ray's next step written on it, and below that, a single word: Henderson. I folded it into my shirt pocket and stood to leave. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray. The kind of gray that settles over Nashville in late summer when the heat finally breaks and the air can't decide what season it wants to be. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. Aaron had a plan. Pruitt had a method. And somewhere in Knoxville, a family had pulled back from a fight that sounded exactly like mine. I needed to know why. Knoxville is 90 minutes from Nashville on I-40, if you leave early enough to miss the truck traffic near Cookeville. I left at 6:30 in the morning before Elijah was awake. I left a note on the kitchen table next to a box of cereal and Dorothy's phone number. I wrote, "Back by lunch. There is orange juice in the refrigerator. You do not need to ask." I drove with the radio off. There are stretches of Tennessee highway where the tree line comes right up to the shoulder, and the road bends through cuts in the limestone ridge like something that was carved rather than built. I've driven that route enough times that my hands know the curves before my eyes do. That morning I wasn't thinking about the road. I was thinking about what a family looks like after it decides to go quiet. I'd seen it on the bench. Families who came in with strong cases and left before the verdict. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was simply the exhaustion of believing that the system would help them and discovering that the system required more from them than they had left to give. The withdrawal of the Henderson complaint had happened 18 months ago. Ray had confirmed the filing date, the attorney of record, and the date of withdrawal. He couldn't tell me why. That was what I was driving to find out. George Henderson lived in a subdivision east of Knoxville, off Strawberry Plains Pike, in a house with a well-kept yard and an American flag on the front porch that hung absolutely still in the windless morning air. He was 63 years old. I knew that from the property records Ray had pulled. He answered the door before I knocked a second time, which told me he'd been watching from inside. He was a solid man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something better, weathered, considered, and watchful. He looked at me the way men of a certain age look at each other, when they already know the conversation isn't going to be simple. "Your gains," he said. "Yes." Ray Simmons called ahead. He opened the door wider. "My wife made coffee." Carol Henderson was 71, small and precise in her movements. She poured without asking and set a plate of sliced pound cake on the table that I understood immediately was not optional. I took a piece. She sat across from me with her hands folded and her eyes direct. "You found the same pattern," she said. It wasn't a question. "My son," I said. "Nelson Pruitt's name appears twice in the transaction records. Coordinating counsel." George set his cup down slowly. "Our son is Michael. He got involved with Pruitt 3 years ago through a commercial real estate referral. Pruitt came recommended by someone in Michael's investment group. Seemed legitimate, experienced. The kind of man who knew the right vocabulary." "They always do," I said. "Michael had POA for Carol's accounts after her hip surgery. Pruitt told him it could be structured to cover the development financing temporarily, that the returns would replace everything within 18 months. George's jaw tightened. There were no returns. There was only the money leaving. "How much?" $190,000, Carol said. Her voice didn't waver. "Over 14 months. I wrote the number on the notepad I'd brought. Below it, I wrote 14 months and circled it. "Why did you withdraw the complaint?" I asked. George looked at Carol. She gave him something with her eyes that I recognized, the kind of permission that long marriages develop into a language of their own. "Pruitt's attorney contacted our lawyer 6 weeks after we filed," George said. "They didn't threaten us directly. It was more surgical than that. They mentioned that Michael had signed every authorization voluntarily, that any prosecution would require Michael to testify against himself, that the optics of an elderly couple pursuing their own son in a criminal proceeding might not reflect well on the family in a community where we'd lived for 30 years. He paused. "And then they mentioned our granddaughter." The room went quiet, in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something important has just been placed on the table. "What about her?" I asked. "Nothing explicit," Carol said. "That was the point. They just mentioned that Michael had a daughter, that children are affected by family instability, that a prolonged legal proceeding creates uncertainty for everyone involved." She picked up her coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. It was enough. I understood. A threat with no fingerprints on it. The kind of pressure that leaves no evidence, because it's applied entirely through implication. Pruitt had done this before. He knew exactly how far to push and precisely where the line was. "I'm not withdrawing," I said. George looked at me steadily. "We know. Ray told us. I need whatever you have. Documents, correspondence, transaction records. Anything that shows Pruitt's coordinating role." Carol stood and left the room. She returned 2 minutes later with a manila envelope that had the solid weight of something that had been waiting to be used. "We made copies the week we withdrew," she said. "We kept them because we knew this wasn't over. We just didn't know who would come back to it." Inside the envelope was a USB drive and 47 pages of printed documents. I could see Pruitt's name on the first page, listed as Coordinating Counsel, beside a transaction authorization dated 26 months ago. I looked up at both of them. "You kept this for 18 months, I said. "We have a granddaughter," Carol said simply. "We kept it because someday someone else's grandfather was going to need it." I drove back to Nashville with the envelope on the passenger seat. I didn't need to open it again. I already knew what it contained. It contained the architecture of a pattern. And patterns in a courtroom are the most persuasive evidence of all. Margaret had arranged for a child forensic interviewer named Phoebe Carver to be present. Phoebe worked out of Vanderbilt's Child Advocacy Center and had testified in family court proceedings enough times that her name carried weight with every judge in Davidson County. She was 40-something, unhurried in her manner, and wore no jewelry except a small silver watch. When she shook Elijah's hand, she crouched slightly so she wasn't looking down at him. He noticed. I could tell by the way his shoulders dropped a quarter inch. We met at Margaret's office on a Saturday morning. I had told Elijah the night before that we were going to talk to some people who helped families when things got complicated. He had looked at me across the dinner table with those careful eyes of his and said, "Is it about my dad?" "Yes," I said. He nodded once and went back to eating. That single nod contained more composure than most adults I'd known on the bench could manage when their lives were under examination. Phoebe started with Elijah alone in the conference room for 20 minutes, while Margaret and I waited in her office. Margaret reviewed documents. I looked out the window at Church Street and thought about the first time I'd brought Aaron to my office, the old courthouse, not this building, when Aaron was 7 years old. He had sat in my chair and held a pen like a gavel and said he was going to be a judge too someday. I had laughed. I couldn't remember now whether I had told him that was a good idea. Phoebe opened the conference room door and gestured for us to come in. Elijah was seated at the end of the table with a piece of paper in front of him. He had been drawing. I came around to look without making a production of it. He had sketched a floor plan, the kind of simplified architectural drawing that children produce when they are trying to communicate something spatial that words haven't organized yet. There were rectangles for rooms, a staircase indicated by parallel lines, and in the lower left corner of the page, a small square room with no windows and a door that opened outward. He had labeled it in careful block letters, "The Quiet Room." In the upper right corner, detached from the main structure by a gap that might have been a hallway, or might have been something else, was a second, smaller shape. He had labeled that one the hitting room. I sat down. Margaret sat beside me. Neither of us spoke. Phoebe said gently, "Elijah, can you tell Mr. Gaines what you told me about the quiet room?" Elijah looked at the drawing rather than at me. "It's in the basement," he said. "There's no light switch on the inside. Dad put a lock on it after the summer before second grade. He said it was for when I needed to think about what I did wrong." He paused. "Sometimes I was in there for a long time." "How long?" I asked. "I don't know exactly. It was hard to tell without a window." He traced the outline of the small square with his finger. "Once I counted to 6,000. I don't know how long that is." I kept my face still. It is a skill you develop on the bench because witnesses read your reactions and adjust their testimony accordingly, consciously or not. But underneath the stillness, I felt something that had no legal terminology. A cold, specific fury, of the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles into the bones and stays. "What about the hitting room?" Margaret asked. Her voice was even. "The garage," Elijah said. "Dad said the garage was better because it didn't matter if things got loud." He looked up at me for the first time since we'd sat down. He used a belt mostly, sometimes his hand. He said it was how his dad taught him, and it worked. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "Did your mother know?" "She knew some of it." He folded his hands on the table in that adult way of his. "She tried to stop it once, and he said if she called anyone, he would make sure she lost custody of me, because she had a history." He paused. "I don't know what her history is, but she was scared of that word." Phoebe was recording the session with Elijah's prior knowledge and consent, as she had explained at the outset. She made a quiet note on her pad. "Elijah," I said, "the letter you put in the pillow. Why the pillow?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "Grandma Ruth's pillow always smelled like apples," he said, "even after she was gone. I figured if you still kept it, You were the kind of person who doesn't throw things away just because they're hard to keep. He looked at his drawing. I figured you were the kind of person who comes. The room held that sentence for a moment. I want to ask you something important, I said. When your dad gets back, are you afraid of what happens next? He thought about it honestly. Yes, he said. But I think I was more scared before I told you. After the session, Margaret walked Phoebe to the elevator. I stayed with Elijah while he finished his drawing. He added 2 figures to the front of the house, one tall, one small, standing outside rather than inside any of the labeled rooms. I didn't ask him who they were. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. Aaron called at 11 o'clock that night. I was at the kitchen table with Margaret's summary document, Ray's investigative notes, and the Henderson file spread across the surface in the organized pattern I'd developed over 40 years of case preparation. Yellow legal pad on the left, source documents in the center, action items on the right. Ruth used to say my kitchen table looked like a courtroom exhibit whenever I was working. She wasn't wrong. The phone screen showed Aaron's name, and I let it ring once more before answering. Dad. His voice was flat, in the specific way it got when he was managing something not emotion exactly, but information. The tone of a man who has calculated what he needs from a conversation before he starts it. I had heard that tone in witnesses, and I had heard it in Aaron since he was 17 years old. Aaron. I'm wrapping up earlier than planned. I'll be there tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I kept my voice level. I thought you weren't back until Tuesday. Plans changed. The project review moved up. A pause. Is Elijah all right? He's fine. He's asleep. Good. Another pause shorter. I'll see you at 9. He ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, and then set it face down on the table. Tomorrow was Sunday. 9 o'clock Sunday morning. That was 36 hours earlier than we had planned for. I looked at the documents spread across the table. Margaret had filed the emergency protective order application that afternoon. The asset freeze petition was drafted, but not yet submitted. Ray had the Henderson USB drive and the transaction records copied and secured, but the formal FBI financial crimes referral was scheduled for Monday morning. We had built the timeline around Tuesday. Aaron coming back Sunday morning changed the geometry of everything. I picked up the phone and called Margaret. She answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear that she had been asleep, but her voice sharpened within 2 sentences. That was the thing about good attorneys. They moved from sleep to clarity faster than most people moved from one room to another. I told her about the call. How did he sound? She asked. Controlled. He knows something has shifted. He may not know what specifically, but he's moving faster because his instincts are telling him to. Does he know about the protective order filing? It was filed this afternoon. The court won't have processed it until Monday at the earliest. But if Pruitt has any contact inside the clerk's office, I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Margaret was quiet for 3 seconds. I'll call Judge Wynn's emergency line first thing in the morning. 6:30. We need the order processed and in hand before 9 a.m. It's a Sunday, which complicates it, but Wynn owes me a returned call from the Lattimore case last spring, and I intend to collect. She paused. Walter, do not let Aaron take Elijah before that order is in hand. You understand me? Completely. I'll also call Ray. The financial referral can't wait until Monday. I'll have him courier the package to the FBI field office tonight if he can manage it. Even an informal notification on record gives us standing. After I hung up, I called Ray. He answered immediately, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Ray operated on a particular frequency that never fully powered down, a trait common to good detectives, and I had come to believe to anyone who had spent enough years watching what people were capable of doing to each other. I told him about Aaron's call. Ray said he would have the financial package delivered to the FBI field office on Impossible Drive before midnight. He said he knew the duty agent and would make sure the receipt was time-stamped. I thanked him and ended the call. It was 11:47. I spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table writing. Not notes this time. A formal 12-page legal summary of every observation, every document, every conversation, from the moment Aaron had dropped Elijah on my porch to the session with Phoebe Carver that afternoon. I wrote it the way I had written judicial opinions: precise, sequential, sourced. Every claim attached to a specific observation or document, every date and time recorded. I signed and dated the last page at 2:51 in the morning and placed it inside the folder Margaret had given me, behind the emergency protective order application and in front of the Henderson documents. At some point after 3 o'clock, I heard Elijah's door open. He came down the hall in the quiet way he moved at night, as if the house had rules about sound after dark that he was still following out of habit. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. "You're still up," he said. "I am." He looked at the documents without asking about them. "Is tomorrow going to be bad?" I considered the honest answer. "It's going to be hard," I said. Hard and bad aren't the same thing. He thought about that. Then he went to the cabinet, took down a glass, and filled it with water from the tap. He did it without asking. The first time he had done that since he arrived. He drank half of it standing at the counter and then looked at me. "Okay," he said, and went back to bed. At 3:17, my phone buzzed with a text from a Nashville area code I didn't recognize. 7 words. He doesn't know I know about the letter. Be ready. I read it twice. Then I saved the number and went back to my summary document and added one more line at the bottom of the last page. I wrote, "Source unknown. Possible internal. Follow morning." Then I closed the folder and waited for the sun to come up. I was dressed by 5:30. There is a particular kind of morning that arrives after a night without real sleep. Not groggy, but hyper-clarified, the way the air feels after a hard rain, when everything is washed to its essential shape. I made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen window, and watched the backyard come out of the dark in slow increments. Ruth's apple trees were visible by 6, their outlines first, then the texture of the leaves, then the specific green that meant late summer was already negotiating its exit. Margaret arrived at 8:30 with a leather portfolio and the emergency protective order signed by Judge Wynn at 7:15 that morning. She had called in the debt from the Lattimore case. Wynn had processed it from his home office and emailed the signed order to the clerk for official filing. It was as of 8:02 a.m., a valid court document with full legal standing. She set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. "We're covered," she said. Detective Paul Morrison arrived 8 minutes later. Ray had arranged for Morrison, a 22-year Metro Nashville veteran, currently assigned to financial crimes, to be present as official law enforcement witness to both the protective order delivery and the initial documentation of the fraud complaint. He was a compact, quiet man who stood near the door with his hands at his sides and said very little, which was exactly what the situation required. I had asked Dorothy to keep Elijah next door for the morning. Dorothy had asked no questions, as was her reliable custom, and had simply said she would make pancakes. At 8:51, Aaron's car turned into the driveway. I watched him through the front window before I opened the door. He sat in the car for approximately 40 seconds after the engine stopped long enough that it wasn't about finishing a phone call or gathering his things. He was preparing himself. I recognized the gesture because I had seen it in every person who had ever walked into a difficult proceeding, knowing the ground had shifted under them, but not yet knowing precisely how. He came up the porch steps with a duffel bag over one shoulder. He was wearing a navy jacket over a gray shirt, and he looked tired, in the way that people look tired when the exhaustion is not physical, but strategic. The weariness of maintaining a position that requires constant management. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked at me, then passed me into the house. His eyes moved the way eyes move when they are conducting a rapid inventory. He registered Margaret standing to my left. He registered Morrison near the kitchen doorway, and the slight adjustment in Morrison's posture when Aaron's gaze reached him. Aaron looked back at me. "Dad," he said carefully. "What is this?" I stepped back and let him in. I didn't answer his question immediately. I had learned long ago that the person who answers first in a tense room concedes the frame of the conversation. I let him walk to the center of the living room, let him stand there with his duffel bag and his careful eyes. And then I picked up the folder from the side table and held it out to him. He took it. He opened it. I watched his face as he read. The emergency protective order was on top, his name listed as respondent in clear judicial typeface. Behind it, the 2-page summary of the financial fraud complaint with the transaction totals and Pruitt's name appearing in the 3rd paragraph. Behind that, a single-page document indicating that a referral package had been received by the FBI field office at 11:58 the previous evening. He read all 3 pages. He was thorough, which was one of the things about Aaron that had always been true, regardless of everything else. He was thorough. He did not skim. He read every line. When he closed the folder, he held it at his side and looked at me. "You can't take him from me," he said. "I'm his father." "The court has taken a position on that for the time being," I said. "Detective Morrison is here as official witness. Margaret Holloway is Elijah's legal representative in these proceedings. If you have questions about the protective order, Margaret can address them. If you have questions about the financial complaint, I'd suggest you find your own counsel before you say anything further." He looked at Margaret. She held his gaze without expression. He looked at Morrison. Morrison said nothing. Aaron's jaw worked once. The duffel bag strap shifted on his shoulder. He was running calculations, I could see it, the same way I had seen it in defendants, in witnesses, in anyone who suddenly finds themselves in a room where the documentation has already outrun their options. The difference between an innocent man and a guilty one in that moment is not guilt or innocence. It is the specific quality of the silence that follows. Aaron's silence had a particular quality. "Did she send you the message?" he said finally. His voice was quieter now. Not defeated, but recalibrated. I said nothing. He looked at the folder one more time, then set it on the side table near the door. He picked up his duffel bag and adjusted the strap. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in a very long time. Something underneath the management and the calculation. Something that might have been a younger version of him, looking for a response he already knew wasn't coming. Then he walked out. I stood at the door and watched him back out of the driveway. I watched until his car reached the end of the street and turned and was gone. When I came back inside, Margaret was already on the phone. Morrison was writing in his notebook. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the place where Elijah always set his backpack when he came in. It was sitting there on the floor, by the chair. He had left it behind when Dorothy took him next door. Left it without thinking, the way you leave behind things you no longer need to carry. I sat down at the table and put my hands flat on the surface and breathed. 23 minutes after Aaron's car disappeared from the end of my street, someone knocked on the front door. I was still at the kitchen table. Margaret had finished her call and was reviewing documents at the counter. Morrison had stepped outside to make a report call from the porch. When the knock came, Margaret looked up at me, and I looked at the door, and neither of us moved for a full second. I stood and walked to the front of the house. Through the narrow window beside the door, I could see a woman standing on the porch. She was in her late 30s, slight, with dark hair pulled back, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time practicing how not to draw attention to themselves. She was holding a canvas tote bag against her side with both hands. She was not looking at the door. She was looking at the street, watching the direction Aaron's car had gone, making sure. I opened the door. She turned. Her eyes were Elijah's eyes, the same careful measuring quality, the same habit of reading a room before committing to it. "Mr. Gaines," she said, "I'm Diana." I had constructed a version of Diana in my mind over the preceding days, built from Elijah's careful disclosures and the anonymous text message, and the shape of her absence in everything he had told me. I had expected someone diminished, someone worn down to the structural minimum by years of managing around a man like Aaron. The woman who sat across from me at my kitchen table was not diminished. She was precise. There is a difference. She set the canvas bag on the table and folded her hands and looked at me directly. "I sent the text last night," she said. "I've been staying with my sister in Brentwood for the past 11 days. Aaron doesn't know where. He thinks I'm at my cousin's place in Murfreesboro." "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "6 months," she said. "Since March, when Elijah came home from school with bruising on his left forearm that Aaron said was from a fall in the backyard." She paused. "I've seen Elijah fall in the backyard. He doesn't fall that way." Margaret had come to sit at the table without making a production of it. She had her legal pad open, but was not writing yet. She was listening. "Why didn't you go to the police directly?" I asked. Diana's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly. "I went to a family attorney in April," she said. "She told me that without documented evidence of abuse, a custody proceeding would likely become a contested evaluation. Aaron's income, his professional standing, the house in his name, all of it would factor in. She told me I needed either physical documentation or a credible independent witness." She looked at me steadily. "A retired federal judge, with his own direct observations, is a credible independent witness." "You needed me to look first," I said. "I needed you to look and find it yourself," she said. "There's a difference. Evidence that a grandfather discovered independently carries different weight than evidence a mother assembled for a custody proceeding. I know how these cases get framed. I know how mothers get characterized when they make allegations without supporting documentation." She unfolded her hands and opened the canvas bag. "So I spent 6 months building the documentation." She placed a flash drive on the table. Behind it, a manila envelope. "The drive has photographs," she said. "Dated time-stamped, taken on a secondary phone Aaron didn't know about. Images of the quiet room in the basement, the lock, the door, the dimensions. Images of Elijah's arm in March. Images of 3 other incidents between January and June." She touched the envelope. The envelope has medical records. 2 urgent care visits that Aaron attributed to sports injuries, and 1 pediatric appointment where I requested a developmental screening that Aaron later told the doctor to disregard. It also has 6 months of bank statements showing the account transfers to Pruitt's Development LLC, which Aaron ran through our joint household account before moving funds to your accounts through the POA. The room was very quiet. "You documented the financial fraud as well," Margaret said. "I documented everything I could reach," Diana said. "I knew that if I came to anyone with only the abuse evidence, the first thing Aaron's attorney would do is characterize me as a vindictive spouse making allegations to gain custody advantage. But if there's financial fraud alongside the abuse, and an independent witness, and a 6-month documented record," she stopped. "It becomes harder to frame." I looked at the flash drive on the table. A small thing to contain 6 months of fear and precision. "Elijah told me about the pillow," I said. "He said he chose it because Ruth's pillow smelled like apples. He said he thought I was the kind of person who comes." Diana's composure shifted for the first time. Not dramatically, just a small settling around her eyes. The specific expression of someone who has held something tightly for a long time and is allowing themselves carefully to set a small portion of it down. "He told me the same thing," she said quietly. "In March, after the bruising, He said he was going to write Grandpa a letter and put it somewhere Grandpa would find it. I told him to wait until the right time. She looked at me. I didn't know when the right time was. I just knew I needed you to look first. Morrison came back in from the porch. He looked at Diana, then at the flash drive, then at me. I'll need to document receipt of that evidence, he said. I know, Diana said. She slid the drive and the envelope across the table toward him. Then she looked at me again with those careful, measuring eyes that were exactly her son's eyes. Is he all right? She asked. Elijah? He left his backpack this morning, I said, for the first time since he arrived. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and nodded once with the composure of someone who has learned to receive good news quietly because they spent too long not being sure it would come. After Diana left with Margaret to begin the formal evidence documentation process, and after Morrison had logged everything and followed them out, I was alone in the house for the first time in days. The quiet was different from the quiet of the preceding week. That quiet had been watchful, the kind of silence that listens for footsteps and processes small sounds into potential threats. This quiet was emptier. Not peaceful exactly, but cleared of the immediate pressure. The way a room feels after furniture has been moved out, and before anything new has been moved in. I went to the study. On the third shelf of the bookcase behind my desk, behind 2 volumes of Tennessee case law I hadn't opened in 4 years, was a shoebox I had put there after Ruth died. I hadn't opened it since. I had kept it because throwing it away felt wrong, and looking at it regularly felt like something I wasn't ready for. So I had put it behind the law books, which was perhaps the most honest thing I had ever done, storing grief behind the professional apparatus I trusted most. I carried the shoebox to the desk and opened it. The photographs were not organized in any particular order, which meant Ruth had assembled them. She had never organized photographs chronologically. She organized them by feeling, grouped by some internal logic of emotional association that I had never fully decoded, but had always trusted. Aaron at 6, sitting on the porch steps with a baseball glove too large for his hand, squinting into the sun, with the specific determination of a child who will not admit the glove doesn't fit. Aaron at 11, standing beside me at the courthouse steps on the day I was sworn in as a circuit court judge, wearing a clip-on tie and an expression of complicated pride. Aaron at 16, turned slightly away from the camera, already beginning the long process of looking elsewhere. That photograph stayed in my hand longer than the others. I could identify the specific year it had changed, not because there was a single event, but because the accumulation of events had a visible weight in retrospect. 16 was the year I had been appointed to the Federal Appellate Consultation Panel, which meant travel, which meant the kind of absence that doesn't announce itself as absence, because it comes with legitimate professional justification. I had been present in the house in the technical sense. I had been at dinner when I was home. I had attended the significant events, graduations, recitals, the milestones that mark time in a family's life. But presence and attention are not the same thing, and children know the difference before they have language for it. I had given Aaron a father who was there and elsewhere simultaneously. I had modeled achievement and authority and the particular discipline of a man who believed that doing your work well was sufficient evidence of love. I had not been cruel. I had not been negligent by any legal standard or social measure. I had simply been insufficient in the specific way that capable, driven men are sometimes insufficient to the emotional requirements of raising a son. I called Hayes Millbrook at noon. Hayes had been Aaron's closest friend from college through his mid-30s, until the friendship had tapered in the way friendships taper when one person's life becomes complicated and requires management. Hayes was a contractor in Chattanooga now, straightforward and undiplomatic in the way that people become when they stopped trying to navigate complicated social terrain. "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years," Hayes said, before I had finished explaining why I was calling. I asked him what he meant. Pruitt, Hayes said. "I met him twice at Aaron's office events. There was something off about the way he talked to Aaron. Not aggressive, the opposite. Too interested. Too validating. Every idea Aaron had was a good idea. Every concern Aaron raised got resolved immediately." Hayes paused. "I've seen that dynamic before, and it never ends well. A man who tells you what you need to hear is usually telling you what he needs you to believe." "Why did Aaron respond to that?" I asked, though I already had a theory. "Because nobody else was," Hayes said quietly. Then, after a pause, "I don't mean that as an accusation, Walter." "I know," I said. Pruitt had not manufactured Aaron's vulnerabilities. He had found them the way skilled manipulators always find existing fault lines, rather than creating new ones. Aaron had wanted authority acknowledged not just professionally, but personally. He had wanted a version of the approval I had distributed sparingly and conditionally throughout his childhood. Always attached to performance. Always calibrated to standards that moved upward as he approached them. Pruitt had offered unconditional validation. And Aaron, who was intelligent enough to build a real estate career, and insufficiently protected against the specific hunger that my particular style of fathering had created, had accepted it. I sat with that for a long time. I was not absolving Aaron. What he had done to Elijah, the quiet room, the garage, the systematic fear installed in a 9-year-old's daily life was not explainable by his childhood, or my failures, or Pruitt's manipulation. Explanation is not absolution. I had spent enough years on the bench to know that understanding the origin of a wrong does not diminish the wrong itself. But I was also not willing to hold the full weight of Aaron's choices, without examining what I had contributed to the conditions that made them possible. That was not guilt in the paralyzing sense. It was accountability in the only sense that matters. The kind that looks directly at what happened and asks, what part was yours? I put the photographs back in the shoebox. I put the shoebox back behind the law books. Then I took it back out again and set it on the corner of the desk where I could see it. Some things should not be stored behind professional apparatus. I had learned that late. But I had learned it. I wrote in the legal pad. Aaron became what he needed. I needed to have been more. Then I closed the pad and went next door to get Elijah. Davidson County Family Court convened at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Aaron had walked out of my house and driven to the end of the street and turned and disappeared. The courtroom was on the second floor of the Juvenile and Domestic Relations Building on 2nd Avenue, a room I had been in many times as a visiting jurist and once as a witness in a colleague's disciplinary proceeding. It was smaller than federal courtrooms and had the particular atmosphere of a space that processes human difficulty at high volume. Worn carpet, fluorescent lighting adjusted to functional rather than dignified, and the specific institutional smell of recycled air and old case files. I sat in the gallery with Dorothy Marsh, who had insisted on coming, and whom I had not argued with because arguing with Dorothy was an inefficient use of anyone's time. Elijah was not present. Margaret had arranged for him to spend the morning with Phoebe Carver at the Advocacy Center, where Phoebe had been conducting weekly sessions with him since the day of his testimony. Margaret was at the petitioner's table. Across from her, Aaron's attorney, a man named Clifford Burrell, whom I recognized from a civil proceeding 3 years prior, sat with a single legal pad and the expression of a man who has reviewed the documentation against his client and arrived at the courtroom without a viable counterargument. Aaron sat beside Burrell in a gray suit. He had lost weight in 3 weeks. Not dramatically, but noticeably, the kind of weight that leaves when a person stops eating with any particular intention. He did not look at me when he came in. He looked at the table in front of him and kept his eyes there with the discipline of someone who has decided that the room exists in a narrower dimension than it actually does. Judge Patricia Wynn entered at 9:04. She was 61, deliberate, and had a reputation in the Nashville legal community for decisions that were unassailable on appeal, because she took the time to be thorough before she was decisive. I had appeared before her twice as an expert witness on federal procedure questions in family matters. She did not acknowledge me in the gallery, which was correct. Margaret presented the dual case structure she had outlined in our first meeting. She moved through the child welfare case first, Phoebe Carver's forensic assessment, the photographic documentation from Diana, the medical records, Elijah's own testimony recorded and transcribed. She presented the evidence without dramatization, which was the right approach. The facts were dramatic enough on their own. Decoration would have diminished them. The financial fraud component followed. Margaret walked the court through the 3 unauthorized transactions, the POA scope violation, the Henderson precedent, and Pruitt's role as coordinating counsel across multiple similar arrangements. She noted that Nelson Pruitt was currently in federal custody on 3 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of conspiracy, and that Aaron had been named as a cooperating witness in the federal proceeding in exchange for reduced exposure on the financial charges. Burrell offered no substantive defense on the child welfare matter. He made 2 procedural objections that Judge Wynn overruled without extended commentary. On the financial matter, he noted Aaron's cooperation with federal investigators, which Margaret had already noted herself, removing whatever mitigating effect Burrell had intended. Aaron was asked twice if he wished to address the court. Twice, he said no. The second time, Judge Wynn looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. Not with contempt, with something more like a professional recognition of the distance between what a person is capable of and what they have done with that capability. I recognized the look. I had worn it myself on the bench more times than I could count. Judge Wynn granted the emergency protective order permanent status, pending a full custody evaluation. She awarded temporary physical custody of Elijah to me, with supervised visitation rights for Diana, contingent on the completion of a family stability assessment, which Margaret had anticipated and for which Diana had already begun the process. She froze Aaron's remaining accessible assets pending resolution of the civil financial complaint. She referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal child abuse charges based on Phoebe's forensic findings. She did all of this in 47 minutes. When she finished, she looked at the courtroom with the specific attention of someone who wants to be sure the room has understood not just the rulings, but their weight. The court's primary concern, she said, is the well-being of the child. Every order issued today proceeds from that concern and returns to it. This court will review the custody arrangement in 90 days. She gathered her documents and left the bench. I stayed in my seat while the room reorganized itself around the conclusion of the proceeding. Dorothy put her hand briefly on my forearm and said nothing, which was precisely right. Aaron stood and exchanged words with Burrell in a low voice. At some point, he turned and looked at me for the first time since he'd walked into the courtroom. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. I held it without looking away. I had sat in judgment of other people's sons for 31 years. I had understood in the abstract that every man in a defendant's chair was someone's child. I had believed I held that understanding with appropriate weight. I had not known what it weighed until now. I stood and buttoned my jacket and walked down the center aisle toward the exit. The carpet was worn in a path down the middle where thousands of people had walked through difficult mornings toward whatever came next. Outside, the September air was beginning to carry the first suggestion of autumn. Not cold yet, but less committed to summer than it had been. I stood on the courthouse steps and thought about Elijah at the Advocacy Center, drawing floor plans and talking to Phoebe in the unhurried way he had begun to talk when he was no longer managing every word for safety. Just as I had told law students in a guest lecture once, is not the restoration of what was. It is the establishment of what should be. I had believed that when I said it. Standing on those steps, I believed it still. But I understood now that it cost more than I had accounted for in the lecture. It cost exactly what it needed to cost. Not more, not less. Just precisely, irreducibly, that. The first morning after the hearing, Elijah came downstairs at 7:15 and made himself a bowl of cereal without asking. It was such a small thing that I almost didn't register it. I was at the counter with my coffee, looking out at the backyard, and I heard the cabinet open and the cereal box come down, and the bowl placed on the counter with the careful precision that was still his default setting. Then I heard the refrigerator open and the milk come out. Then the specific sound of cereal hitting a bowl, which is one of those sounds so ordinary that most people have stopped hearing it entirely. I did not turn around. I did not comment. I drank my coffee and looked at the apple trees, and let the sound of a boy making his own breakfast exist in the kitchen without ceremony. After a moment, he came and stood beside me at the counter. "The trees need water," he said. "They've needed water for a week," I said. "I've been occupied." He looked at them through the window with a considering expression. "I could do it," he said, "if you show me how much." "After breakfast," I said. He went back to his cereal. I refilled my coffee. Margaret had arranged for Elijah to begin twice-weekly sessions with a child therapist named Dr. Susan Okafor, whose office was in Brentwood, in a building that looked more like a residential house than a clinical facility, which Margaret said was intentional. Dr. Okafor had a waiting list that Margaret had navigated through a professional connection, and the first appointment was Wednesday of that week. I drove Elijah there and waited in a sitting room that had good natural light and magazines I didn't read. When Elijah came out after 50 minutes, he was carrying a small, smooth stone that Dr. Okafor apparently gave to every new patient at the end of the first session. He turned it over in his hand in the car on the way home. "She asked me what I was good at," he said. "What did you tell her?" "Drawing. And being quiet." He paused. "She said being quiet was a skill. She said most people couldn't do it." "She's right," I said. He put the stone in his jacket pocket and looked out the window at the passing neighborhood. "She asked me if I was angry," he said. "I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was a good answer." I kept my eyes on the road. "It is a good answer. Are you angry?" he asked. I thought about the honest answer, which was that anger was not the primary thing I was feeling, but that it was present in the way that a low fire is present, not consuming, but steady and unlikely to go out quickly. "Yes," I said. "Some." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Me too," he said quietly. "Some." By Thursday of that first week, 3 specific things had changed that I noted in the legal pad I had repurposed from evidence documentation to something closer to a journal. The first was the backpack. He had not picked it up from the kitchen floor since the morning of Aaron's visit. On Wednesday evening, I had moved it to the hook by the back door where Ruth used to hang her gardening jacket. He had not objected or moved it back. The second was the eating. By Thursday morning, he was no longer eating with the meticulous portion control that had characterized his first days in the house. He took what he wanted. He left what he didn't finish. On Thursday, he asked if he could have a second piece of toast, and was already reaching for the bread before I answered, catching himself mid-reach and pulling his hand back with the automatic caution of old habit. I said, "You don't have to ask about toast." He looked at me for a moment. Then he took the bread and put it in the toaster. The third thing was laughter. It happened on Friday evening when Dorothy came over for dinner and told a story about a former student who had convinced her entire third-grade class that their classroom turtle had escaped and was living in the school cafeteria. The story was not particularly sophisticated in its humor, but Dorothy told it with the timing of someone who had refined it over many retellings. And at the punchline, Elijah laughed genuinely, without managing it the full, unguarded laugh of a child who has forgotten for a moment to monitor his own responses. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Dorothy glanced at me over his head with an expression I would not attempt to describe in legal language. I looked back at my plate and kept my face neutral because I did not want to make the moment self-conscious by acknowledging it too directly. After dinner, while Dorothy was helping clear the table, Elijah went to the study and came back with a piece of paper and a pencil. He sat at the kitchen table and drew for 20 minutes while Dorothy and I talked. When he finished, he pushed the paper across the table to me without comment and went to wash his hands. It was a drawing of a house. Not a floor plan this time. An exterior view with windows that had curtains and a front porch, and 2 apple trees in the backyard, rendered with the particular careful attention he gave to things he considered important. In the front yard, 2 figures, one tall, one small. The tall one had its hand on the small one's shoulder. The small one was smiling. I folded the drawing carefully and put it in the shoebox on the corner of my desk, where it took its place beside the photographs of Aaron at 6 with the oversized baseball glove, and Aaron at 11 with the clip-on tie, and Aaron at 16 looking elsewhere. I put it there because the shoebox was where I kept things that needed to be remembered in full, not just the parts that were easy to look at, but all of it, together, in the same container. That night, I wrote 1 line in the legal pad before I went to bed. He drew the door open. Diana came for lunch on a Saturday, 2 weeks after the hearing. Margaret had confirmed that informal, supervised visits could begin before the formal stability assessment concluded, provided both parties agreed and the visits were documented. Diana had agreed immediately. I had agreed without hesitation. The supervision requirement was a procedural step on a path already directed toward the right outcome. I made turkey sandwiches on whole wheat and sliced apples from Ruth's tree. The apples had come in early this year, small and tart. I set everything on the table without ceremony, because ceremony would have made the occasion feel managed. And what the occasion required was precisely the opposite. Elijah heard Diana's car from the backyard where he was watering the trees. He came through the back door with water still dripping from his hands, wiping them on his jeans, and stood in the kitchen doorway. Diana came through the front. They looked at each other across the kitchen with the careful attention of 2 people verifying that both had come through something and were still standing. Then Elijah crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her waist. She put both hands on the back of his head. They stayed that way for a moment I did not time. I went to the counter and poured 3 glasses of water and gave them what they needed. We ate without discussing the legal proceedings. There had been enough formal conversation in the preceding weeks. Instead, Diana asked Elijah about the apple trees, and he explained the watering schedule and the difference between Ruth's 2 varieties, with the quiet authority of someone who has recently acquired knowledge and found it worth having. Diana listened the way mothers listen when they are reclaiming ordinary moments, not waiting for important information, but simply present for the texture of a child being himself. She asked follow-up questions. He answered carefully at first, then less carefully, the way a person relaxes into a conversation when they stop monitoring it. After lunch, Elijah went to the study to draw. Diana and I sat on the back porch with coffee. "Hayes Millbrook," I said. "He told me he helped arrange the connection between us." Diana held her cup in both hands. "Hayes called me in February. He'd seen Aaron at a professional event and said something had shifted, not just professionally, but personally. He asked what I was doing about it. I told him I was building documentation. He asked whether I had considered approaching you directly." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I had considered it and decided against it. I didn't know you personally, Walter. I knew your reputation. I knew Aaron's version of you, which was complicated. And approaching a retired federal judge with an informal request to investigate my own husband could move in directions I couldn't control. She paused. Control mattered. I had very little of it elsewhere. What changed your mind? Elijah, she said. In March, after the bruising, he told me about the letter plan. He said he was going to write to you and hide it somewhere you would find it. I asked him why he believed you would look. He said because you still kept Grandma Ruth's pillow on the bed, and anyone who kept something that hard to keep was the kind of person who came when needed. She set her cup down. A 9-year-old told me that. I called Hayes the next morning. The summer visit wasn't Aaron's idea, I said. Aaron believed it was his idea. Hayes planted it in a casual conversation, framed it as a practical solution for managing Elijah's summer while Aaron traveled. Aaron heard convenience. That was what he was listening for. She paused. It was designed to sound like his own thought. And the letter. Elijah knew the timing. I told him in June that the right moment was coming. I didn't tell him exactly when or what to do. I told him to trust his own judgment. She looked at me. He has better judgment than most adults involved in this entire process. I thought about the floor plan drawing on Margaret's conference table, the careful block letters, the small square room labeled the quiet room, the boy who had counted to 6,000 in the dark and emerged with his capacity for precise observation not just intact, but sharpened. You built the entire plan around trusting him to execute it, I said. I built it around knowing my son, she said. There's a difference. She looked at the trees with the expression of someone who has set down something heavy and is noticing with some surprise that her hands still work. Hayes said you were the right person, she said. He said once you saw something, you couldn't pretend you hadn't. He said the problem with you was never seeing it, was looking. She glanced at me. He meant it as a compliment. I understood it as one, I said. From the study came the faint, steady scratch of Elijah's pencil on paper, unhurried. The sound of someone working without looking over his shoulder. Ruth planted those trees 22 years ago, I said. She told me she wasn't certain she'd live to see a full harvest from both of them. Diana looked at them. Did she? 17 years, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's enough. I held the word against everything it contained. 17 years of harvest of coffee on this porch of a marriage sufficient to the things that mattered most. Of 2 apple trees still standing and producing fruit for a boy learning how much water was the right amount. Yes, I said. It is. Aaron had been at the Riverbend Correctional Facility in East Nashville for 11 days when I drove out to see him. It was not a decision I arrived at quickly. I had sat with it for the better part of 2 weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a legal question that has no clean answer, examining it from multiple angles, testing the reasoning, looking for the flaw in the logic that would tell you to leave it alone. The flaw never materialized. What materialized instead was the understanding that not going was also a decision, and that I had made enough decisions by omission in Aaron's life to last me the remainder of it. I called ahead and arranged the visit through the facility's standard process. I did not tell Margaret. Not because I was concealing it, but because it was not a legal matter. It was a father matter, and those 2 categories had different protocols. The visiting room at Riverbend was institutional in the specific way of spaces designed for difficult conversations. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a table with a laminate surface worn smooth at the edges, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like a slightly worse version of themselves. I had been in rooms like it many times as a judge. I had never been in one as a father. Aaron came in wearing the facility's standard issue clothing. He had lost more weight since the hearing. His face had the specific hollowed quality that appears when a person stops maintaining a version of themselves for external consumption, and what remains is the unmanaged original. He sat down across from me and put his hands flat on the table. He said, "I didn't think you'd come." "I wasn't sure I would," I said. I came anyway. He looked at his hands. How is Elijah? He left his backpack on the kitchen floor the morning you came to the house. He hasn't picked it up since. I paused. He's drawing. He's eating without asking permission. Last Friday, he laughed at one of Dorothy's stories and didn't catch himself first. Aaron's jaw moved once. He kept his eyes on his hands. I'm not here to report on Elijah, I said. I'm here because I have questions, and I believe you're the only person who can answer them honestly. He looked up. What questions? Pruitt, I said. How it started. Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back slightly and looked at the wall above my head, with the expression of a man locating the beginning of a story he has not yet told in full. The Meridian Street project was already in trouble in the spring of that year, he said. I'd overextended on the acquisition. The financing structure had assumptions built in that didn't hold when the commercial lease market softened. I needed a bridge solution fast enough that I didn't have time to be careful about where it came from. Pruitt came recommended, I said. Through the investment group, yes. He came in with language that made sense, temporary bridge financing structured through existing POA authority, returns timed to the project's projected completion. He had documentation. He had precedent cases. He had the vocabulary of legitimacy. Aaron paused. He also had something else. What? He told me I was right. Aaron said it flatly, without self-pity, as a man states a fact he has had time to examine. Every concern I raised, he resolved. Every doubt I had, he reframed. He told me the project was sound, my instincts were correct. The problem was external market conditions rather than my decisions. He said I was the kind of man who saw opportunities that more cautious people missed. He stopped. I knew it was what I wanted to hear. I took it anyway. The room was quiet except for the ambient sound of the facility. Distant doors, muffled voices. The institutional hum of a building that processes human difficulty at scale. Why Elijah? I said. It was not entirely a question. Aaron was silent for a long time. Long enough that I considered whether he would answer at all. I told myself it was discipline, he said finally. I told myself I was teaching him the thing you taught me, that the world doesn't accommodate weakness, that standards exist for a reason, that a man who can't hold himself to a requirement can't be trusted with anything important. He looked at me directly for the first time. You taught me that. Not with a belt, but you taught me that. I held his gaze. I know, I said. I turned it into something else, he said. I know that. I've had 11 days in a room with not much else to do but know that. You did, I said. What you did to Elijah is not explainable by what I did to you. I want to be clear about that. I know that too. But I was present and absent simultaneously for most of your childhood, I said. I was in the house and elsewhere. I gave you standards and withheld the thing that should have come with them. I paused. That's mine. I'm not distributing it to reduce what you're responsible for. I'm acknowledging it because it's true, and because I should have said it 20 years ago. Aaron looked at his hands again. The fluorescent light did its flattening work on both of us. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, he said. Nothing right now, I said. It doesn't require an immediate response. I said it because it needed to be said, not because I need something back from it. We sat in the particular silence of two people who have exchanged something real and are allowing it to settle without rushing toward resolution. There was no resolution available in that room on that day, and we both understood it. I stood when the time signal came. Aaron remained seated. Elijah asked me last week if I was scared, I said. During everything. I told him every single day. Aaron said nothing. He put his hand on my arm, I said. 9 years old. I left without saying anything else. Some endings don't require a final line. They require only that you showed up, said what was true, and walked back out into the air. October came to Nashville the way it always does. Not all at once, but incrementally. The heat releasing its claim on the air, a few degrees at a time, until one morning you walk outside and the season has changed without announcing itself. The apple trees in the backyard had gone from late summer green to the specific yellow gold of October foliage, and the fruit was ready. Elijah discovered this on a Tuesday morning before school. He came downstairs, looked out the kitchen window and said, "The apples are ready," with the authority of someone who has been monitoring a situation and is now reporting its conclusion. "They are," I said. "Can we pick them today?" "After school," I said. He ate his breakfast quickly that morning. Not with the old precision of a boy managing his intake against invisible rules, but with the practical efficiency of someone who has somewhere to be and would like to get there. We picked apples that Friday afternoon, the two of us working through the trees with the basket Ruth had kept on the back porch for exactly this purpose. It was a wide, flat basket with a worn handle that had been repaired once with electrical tape sometime in the early 2000s. Ruth had never replaced it because she said a basket that had been used enough to need repair was a basket that knew its job. Elijah worked methodically, checking each apple with both hands before adding it to the basket, the way I had shown him. Firm pressure at the stem, slight twist, pull. He had the focused attention he brought to everything physical, the concentration of a child who takes instructions seriously and applies them without shortcuts. "Grandma Ruth did this every year?" he asked. "Every October for 22 years, I said. He considered this while turning an apple in his hands. "Did she make things with them?" "Pie mostly. Apple butter. Sometimes just slice them and put them in a bowl on the counter." I reached for a high branch. "She said the point wasn't what you made. The point was the picking." He added the apple to the basket. "Why?" "Because picking requires you to pay attention to each one individually," I said. "You can't pick apples in a hurry and get it right." She said it was the one task in the year that forced her to slow down completely. Elijah looked at the tree. "I like it," he said simply. We filled the basket in an hour. The afternoon light had gone to the low amber of late October, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they've been considered carefully. And the backyard held it the way the backyard always held it. Quietly, without making a production of being beautiful. I made Ruth's apple recipe that evening. It was not technically a pie, more of a deep dish apple cake, dense and not overly sweet, with cinnamon and a specific ratio of brown sugar to white that Ruth had never written down, but that I had watched her make enough times to have internalized. Elijah sat at the kitchen counter and watched me work. With the focused observation he applied the things he intended to learn. "Are you going to teach me?" he asked. "I'm teaching you right now," I said. "Watch the ratio." Diana arrived at 6 as we had arranged. She came in through the back door, which had become her door over the preceding weeks. The front door was for official occasions. The back door was for Saturdays and dinners and the gradual accumulation of ordinary visits that build the structure of a family's life. She looked at the kitchen, the flour on the counter, the bowl of sliced apples, Elijah on the stool with his elbows on the counter, and something in her face settled, in the way faces settle when they encounter something they had wondered if they would ever see. We ate on the back porch as the evening came in. The apple cake was correct, not identical to Ruth's, because nothing is ever identical to the version made by the person who originated it, but close enough to carry the essential character of the thing. Elijah ate 2 pieces, without commenting on the quantity. After dinner in the quiet of the porch, with the October air coming in from the tree line, Elijah looked at me with the direct attention he reserved for questions he had been holding for a while. "Were you scared?" he asked. "During all of it?" "Every single day," I said. He thought about this seriously. "But you kept going." "Yes." Why? I looked at the apple trees in the last of the evening light. They stood the way they had stood for 22 years, undemonstrative, patient, producing what they were made to produce, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Because some things are worth being scared for, I said. He reached over and put his hand briefly on my forearm. The gesture lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then he picked up his plate and took it inside, letting the screen door close quietly behind him. Diana looked at me across the porch table. Ruth would have liked him, I said. She would have loved him, Diana said. There's a difference. Later, after Diana had gone and Elijah was asleep, I sat alone on the porch with the last of the coffee and the dark yard and the 2 apple trees that Ruth had planted, knowing she might not see both of them fully mature. She had planted them anyway, because that was the nature of certain investments. You make them not for the return you will collect, but for the return that will exist after you. Some people plant things knowing they won't be there for every harvest. They plant them anyway. Ruth had understood that. I was still learning it. But I was learning it in the right yard, with the right boy asleep upstairs, and the trees still standing. That was enough to keep going. I wrote 3 letters on a Sunday night in late October. Not for court, not for documentation, not for any proceeding or record or official purpose. I wrote them because there were things that needed to be said in the specific register that only letters allow the register of a man sitting alone at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with no audience and no performance requirement and nothing to manage except honesty. The first letter was to Ruth. I told her about Elijah, about the backpack on the kitchen floor and the cereal bowl taken down without asking, and the laugh at Dorothy's story that lasted 4 seconds and contained more information about recovery than any clinical assessment I had read. I told her about the apple trees and the basket with the electrical tape handle and the way Elijah had said, "I like it when I explained," why she valued the picking over the product. I told her that her pillow had done more legal work than most evidence I had ever admitted in 31 years on the bench, and that the apple smell she had left in it had traveled further than either of us could have planned. I told her I missed her in the specific daily way that doesn't diminish with time, but becomes more familiar. The way a landmark becomes familiar, always present, always noted, eventually incorporated into the ordinary navigation of a life. I told her she had been right about most things. I told her she had been right about the things that mattered most. I did not specify which things, because she already knew which things, and letters to people who know you don't require that kind of elaboration. The second letter was to Aaron. I had said most of what needed to be said in the visiting room at Riverbend. But spoken words in institutional spaces carry the acoustics of the room, the fluorescent light, the bolted chairs, the ambient pressure of a facility that processes difficulty at volume. Written words carry only themselves. I told Aaron that I had found the photographs in the shoebox, that I had spent time with the one of him at 16 turned away from the camera, already beginning to look elsewhere. I told him I understood now what he had been looking away from, and that the understanding had come too late to be useful to him as a boy, but was available to him as a man if he chose to use it. I told him that explanation was not absolution. I had said this at Riverbend, and I said it again in the letter, because it was important enough to say twice. What he had done to Elijah was his, fully, and the origins of it did not redistribute the weight of it. But I also told him that I was not finished with him, that a father who was finished with his son was a father who had confused justice with abandonment, and I had spent enough years on the bench to know the difference. I told him that Elijah had put his hand on my arm on the back porch, and that the gesture had lasted 3 seconds, and contained more forgiveness than I deserved, and more grace than I had taught either of them to expect. I told him his son was extraordinary. I told him that was not an accident of nature, that somewhere in the construction of Elijah Aaron had contributed something worth having. and that whatever came next, that was true and would remain true. I did not tell him I forgave him. I was not there yet. But I told him the door was not closed, which was the honest version of the same direction. The third letter was to myself. This one was shorter. It did not require the same elaboration, because I already knew everything in it. Writing it was not for new information. Writing it was for the specific purpose of making the reckoning official, the way a judge signs an order, not because the decision wasn't already made, but because the signature is what makes it binding. I wrote, "You were present and absent simultaneously. You gave standards without the thing that should have accompanied them. You stored grief behind law books and called it managing. You looked at your son and saw performance instead of need and called it fathering." Then I wrote, "You looked at your grandson and saw what was there. You went to Knoxville. You sat in the visiting room. You picked apples and taught the ratio and left the door open. You are not finished." I signed it with my full name, Walter James Gaines. The same signature I had put on 31 years of judicial orders, the same name I had carried through everything. The name had accumulated the achievements and the failures, and the shoebox behind the law books, and the 2 apple trees, and the boy asleep upstairs. When the letters were finished, I folded them carefully. Ruth's into thirds, the way she had always folded correspondence. Aaron's into a plain envelope I would mail in the morning. The one to myself into a single fold. And I carried them down the hall to Elijah's room. He was asleep on his back, with one arm across the blanket, and his face completely unguarded in the specific way that children's faces are unguarded in sleep. Open to the air, defended against nothing, as honest as anything I had ever seen. I lifted the edge of his pillow and placed all 3 letters underneath it. Then I set the pillow back down. He had placed his letter under a pillow to reach the right person. I was placing mine under the same pillow to close the circle. What he had begun in fear and precision and a 9-year-old's extraordinary faith, I was ending in the only way it deserved to end. Quietly, in the dark, with no audience in the room, where the right person had finally shown up. I stood at the door for a moment before I turned off the light. The apple trees were visible through the window above Elijah's bed, 2 shapes in the October dark, still and patient and continuing. I turned off the light and went to bed. Some loops take a lifetime to close. The important thing is that you close them. The important thing is that you don't leave them open for the next generation to inherit. Elijah would wake in the morning and make his cereal, and water the trees, and draw his careful drawings, and carry forward whatever we had managed to give him that was worth carrying. He would do this not because the past had been erased, but because the present had been rebuilt around something sturdier than fear. That was the work. That had always been the work. It just took me 67 years and one boy on a porch with a backpack held too tightly to understand it completely. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. I never raised my hand. I let the truth speak for a boy who could not speak for himself. The Bible says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." I believe that now more than ever. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Subscribe to Male Revenge, and may God keep watch over your family.